You're standing in front of the judge and jury, ready to defend your client because you believe he's been wrongfully convicted. You make your case, and in the midst of your conversation to convince the jury, they have a hard time understanding you. You're stumbling over your words. You're using words that confuse and distract them. At the end, the jury makes their verdict. And what do you think happens?
Yo.
Today we're going to talk about articulation and the importance of being able to articulate your thoughts and ideas. And the person who's going to help us with this is Dr. Jordan Peterson. But first, what is articulation? Articulation is expressing one's own self readily, clearly, and effectively. And in short, being able to talk or speak properly or well.
Well, articulate is an interesting word, because if your joints are articulated, and that means you can do things with them because they're articulated, right? They're not one solid, vague mass. They're differentiated. And someone who's exceptional form of the capacity to be dangerous than to be articulate. And one of the things that really shocks me, part of the reason that my son and I and our co-workers developed this essay app, is that young men in particular are never taught this. It's like, well, why be literate? Well, do you want to be competent and dangerous, or do you want to be vague and useless? Because those are your options, and I don't care what your job is. It doesn't matter what you end up doing.
Let's stop here for a second. Do you want to be competent and dangerous, or vague and useless? It's interesting that he brings those 2 points, because if you have ever been in the situation where you had an idea or a thought and you're trying to express it to somebody you're talking to, but you're being a bit more vague about it, and you just simply expect the other person to understand what you're saying, your lack of articulation in that situation makes it harder for you and the other person. But let's take that same example where you are talking to that person, but you are more articulate in that situation. What that shows is the level of competency in what you're saying. And I believe when Jordan is saying dangerous, he's mainly referring to the power one has, or she has, when they are articulate. Just a good side note.
If you're a plumber, great respect for plumbers, by the way, and you're articulate, you can negotiate with your clients, you can introduce your coworkers, you can make a case for your employees, you can advertise your services, you can think through your problems. You're firing on all cylinders. Our whole culture is based on the idea of the supremacy of the word. Our whole culture is based on the idea that it is the word itself that extracts habitable order from chaos and possibility. And the reason our culture is predicated on that is because it's a deep truth. And to the degree that our culture actually embodies that, it works. So it's a great thing to be articulate. And it would be so lovely if our educators were wise enough to communicate this appropriately to young men who are striving forward, and to let them know in no uncertain terms that if they want to make themselves into forces to be contended with, that there's no surer route to that than an exceptional poetic literacy. Now, it's not like young people don't have an intuition of this. There are reasons they admire rap musicians, for example, who are often extraordinarily articulate in their performance and their capacity for spontaneous poetic utterance. And certainly the greatest people I've met, including great warriors, you might say, are great in no small part because they're articulate. I know a former special services, special operations soldier, Jocko Willink. Some of you might know about Jocko. He's got a pretty decent online following, and he's about 4 feet wide and about 3 feet thick, and he's one tough son of a bitch. I'll tell you, you don't want to mess with him, and he knows perfectly well and is very capable of articulating the fact that his success as a eminent warrior is in no small part dependent on his ability to communicate. Because he could communicate well, he could listen to the men who were under his command. Because he was articulate, he could explain to his superiors the situation on the ground. Because he was articulate, he could make a case that the men under his command who were deserving would be promoted. Because he could think in an articulate manner, he could plan strategically and not lose battles. Okay, so that's the case for being articulate. And what's the alternative? You want to be inarticulate? You want to say and like and and pause and stumble and be unable to formulate a strategy, be unable to elucidate.
Funny he says that, because when it comes to most people, when trying to better themselves as well as their speech and trying to be more articulate, the and the stumbling over words, that's actually the main reason that most people feel insecure about their own speech. And eventually that's what leads them to seek out coaches, speech clubs, or even just practicing in general. And which obviously Peterson is all about, but he makes a brilliant case in who do you want to be? And most of us would like to be the former, either competent and dangerous. And
compel and convince other people, to entice them with your articulated vision of what might be. You want the opposite of that? Why would you want that? You would choose awkwardness over grace? It's preposterous. It's beyond foolish. And I cannot understand for the life of me why this case isn't made in a compelling manner, particularly to young men. And I know it's not being articulated to young men because they're dropping out of the educational realm in droves. And it's unbelievably sad. So, how do you become articulate? Well, by paying attention to what you say. That's a good start. And what do I mean by that? I mean, pay attention to what you say. So you can think of this as an analogy. So imagine that you're trying to walk across a swamp, and the swamp is murky, but you know there's a path. You know there's a path of stone under the water, but it twists and moves. And if you stay on the path, you won't drown. The crocodiles in the swamp won't devour you. And as you walk forward, you can feel with your next step where the stone might be. And then you feel it's solid. Then you take that step, and then you do the same thing with your foot again. You search and you find out what's solid, and you step on it, and you move forward in that manner. That's what you do with your words. It's the same thing. You feel, and you feel, is this the right word? Is the fact that I'm uttering it putting me together and making me intact and stronger, or is it tearing me apart and making me dissolute and weak? And you can learn to do that. I learned this in part from reading Carl Rogers, who's a great clinician, and Rogers believed that the integration of language and action was a necessary precondition for operation as an effective clinician, that you had to align what you said with who you were, and that one of the things that your clients would be evaluating you for was that.
So I understand what he's saying in this analogy, when it comes to using certain words, you have to understand first, and also you need to be aware of what words you're using. And if there's a better word that he used in this sentence, be aware of it so that you can choose the right word the next time this same situation comes, or maybe you could start adopting better words to describe what you're trying to say and increasing your vocabulary. Also, he does mention the word dissolute and weak, meaning basically lacking restraint. And I know that for me, when it comes to word choices, one of the words that I tend to default to, especially when I can't describe or don't know specifically what I'm trying to say, I will always default to saying, "Do you know what I mean?" And using that word wasn't the issue; it was frequently using that word being the problem. For example, there will be situations where I will have a hard time trying to describe or say something, and I'll simply just default to saying, "You know what I mean?" And what it did in that situation is that it made me seem a bit weak, and the other person had to play catch up or just do that fake. Yeah, I understand, man. I understand. When you know in reality they don't understand. If you don't understand what you're saying, how can you expect them to understand what you're saying? So just to say and sure that I understand that many people, that's a struggle that they're having, and the good thing about Peter saying that he is giving you that choice in the avenues that you can take. One, that's obviously being the obvious choice, being competent and dangerous, and the latter being vague and useless. So yeah, it's just interesting that he mentions that, to be honest. So I would highly recommend you go finish the rest of the video. There's a link on in the description. But in short, Peterson is absolutely right in feeling the words, being aware of the word choices, and honestly seeing if there's better ways to say certain ways and then increasing the vocabulary. And so what I would say is that start listening to yourself and make the proactive steps and efforts to get rid of the likes, and pauses just to get started. So pretty much, yeah. All right, folks, be gentle.
And articulate!